Recovery works because we're not all crazy on the same day. Andrew Wilkinson joins us from Granite Mountain Behavioral Healthcare. He talks about somatic experiencing, approaching our bodies as a connected body and mind. He talks about regulation in our nervous system and healing it from within in order to regain control of our lives in recovery. Enjoy. Welcome to the Illuminate Recovery podcast. We shed light on mental health issues, mental illness, and addiction recovery. Ways to cope, manage, and inspire. Beyond the self-care we will discuss, you may need the help of a licensed professional. My name's Kurt Nider. I'm a husband, a father, entrepreneur, a handyman, and a student of life. I avoid conflict, I deflect with humor, and I'm fascinated by the human experience.
And I'm Shelley Mangum. I am a clinical mental health counselor, and my favorite role of all times is grandma. I am a seeker of truth, and I feel like life should be approached with tremendous curiosity.
I ask the dumb questions.
I fill in the gaps.
The Illuminate Recovery podcast is brought to you by Illuminate Billing Advocates. Make billing and collection simple with leader in substance abuse and mental health billing services. Verification and analysis of benefits, pre-authorizations, utilization management, accurate claim submission and management, denial and appeal management, and industry-leading reporting. Improve your practice's cash flow and your ability to help your clients with Illuminate Billing Advocates.
Today on the Illuminate Recovery podcast, Kurt and I are really pleased to be able to welcome Andrew Wilkinson. Andrew is a somatic experiencing and neuroaffective relational model practitioner. He works at Granite Mountain Behavioral Healthcare, and he also does some consulting on the side, primarily assisting individuals in navigating their way through adversity and accumulated stress while bringing lasting recognition to their innate ability to heal, self-regulate, and build resiliency. Andrew, thanks for being willing to talk with us today. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Of course, yeah. Thank you so much for having me. I'm grateful to be here.
So, as a therapist, I would love to kind of talk about and maybe have you share a little bit about how you ended up in the somatic experience and neuroaffective relational model of practice, and what drove you there. What took you to that approach?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's a long story that I can give in the Reader's Digest version, but throughout the path of my own recovery, I'm in recovery and have been for quite a while. I had to seek my own treatment quite a few times. Right. I have personal experience with trauma, and so really that's what drew me to this field is my own lived experience with it. But, coming in 2010 and then starting to really observe what are the core issues, right? Looking at why is it that, treatment is really effective for some people. Addiction treatment is primarily what I work in, and why is it not for others? And so I was working in many different roles. I've been in the administrative side and the program development side, and, even the billing side, and landed with a really wonderful supervisor at one point who was a somatic experiencing practitioner himself. And he was so excited about this modality, and knowing this person and trusting him, I just started to ask quite a few questions. And I started to attend the trainings in 2016 really on a whim and wanting to know more myself. And within the first couple days of this module that I was in, to put it in short, I was kind of hooked. It made all too much sense to me, and there was a lot of information about what the holes are. What I see wrong with people healing in general. And so my curiosity was sparked, and I really ran with it. And so then I ended up getting certified in somatic experiencing and finishing the training, and started assisting some of the training and getting close to the teachers involved with that organization, and really since then have been applying it to every time I'm involved with a client I have this modality in the back of my mind. It's hard to kind of unlearn these things once you learn them, because it illuminates so many of the holes that I see in what clients are receiving nowadays in treatment, both for straight up substance use and mental illness. So that's how I really started to engage in somatic experiencing. It wasn't anything but a suggestion of someone I trusted, and then I found out how helpful it was, so I continued with it.
That's awesome. And somatic experiencing, although it's probably not as new as maybe it feels, it's been around for a long time, but I think it's starting to get a much better foothold and a better understanding of how it helps people and how it affects people. Would you agree with that?
I would. Yeah, I definitely would. I think it's definitely gaining traction. Now, again, I've only been aware to it since 2016, but in my experience, when I tell people, oh, I do this thing, somatic experiencing, 9 times out of 10, they don't know what that is. In the treatment world, of course, it's becoming a bit more familiar, but primarily, EMDR and the more classic cognitive therapies that have been around, people are more familiar with those than SE.
So Shelley's smart, and she probably knows what you're talking about, but I fit into the 9 out of 10. So I don't even know what somatic experiencing is. Can you explain it to me?
Sure. Yeah, I can do my best. So somatic experiencing, it's a bottom-up processing, right? So most therapies, to my understanding, and I'm pretty simple-minded myself, my only education is really through experience being in the field and then getting certified in somatic experiencing. But how it compares to other therapies is we're really looking at the body and the mind as the same thing. Having grown up in America, right, like we do separate the two quite a bit. It's my understanding that in other countries and to more Eastern philosophies that they haven't really distinguished between the body and the mind, right? They're very connected. But here, and receiving my own treatment, it was almost always cognitive and very thought-based, which is really helpful. Don't get me wrong, but when we do SE, we're involving the stress response. And so our belief is that within the nervous system, the stress response has been thwarted, or it's been, shocked in a way that it has altered the way we react to everyday life, right? So there's certain hormones that our nervous system is pumping through our bodies, specifically cortisol and all these things that help us adapt to just everyday anxieties and dangers. And when our nervous system is dysregulated, we're not going to have a normal response. And we're going to, have a lot of different, bodily issues, which involves the cognitive and in our understanding. So, yes, somatic really, when we talk about healing from within, it is that in the truest sense. So we're paying a lot of attention to someone's, feelings and sensations, and not just the stories that they're telling us. I know that was kind of a long-winded response, and I hope that answers your question.
Yeah.
Well, and I think it's, and do correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm still learning a lot about this approach. I've heard about it for years, but there's still a lot that we need to learn. But I think it's, it kind of comes from, a lot of it comes from Bessel van der Kolk and his Body Keeps the Scorebook, in that idea that our cells and all of those pieces in our body keep those memories and they hold on to them. And if we can't experience that and become aware of that, then our body, it ends up coming out sideways, and that's where we get that emotional dysregulation. In a nutshell, I said that pretty simply.
No, I think you explained it much better than I did. I'm an overthinker, right? Which is probably why I'm attracted to this. But there's so many ways to describe it, but that's really it. And as far as Bessel van der Kolk, I know that Dr. Peter Levine, the creator of somatic experiencing, and Bessel are close, right? And I know that they have interacted quite a bit on the topic of trauma. But that book is always a wonderful reference to learn about, somatics involved with trauma.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up Peter Levine too, because I believe he is highly involved in these training, in some somatic training.
Yeah.
Is that who you got yours through?
So I didn't. I have done some consultation with Peter, and I've seen him briefly, but he does most of the advanced level and specific trainings. Now, the general, to get certified in somatic experiencing training, there's a ton of different faculty that have been around since the dawn that are doing those. And I received my training from Dr. Joshua Sylvain.
Awesome. Yeah, there are some really great practitioners out there. And I think that maybe, Andrew, if you're willing, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, you talked about the holes that, our traditional CBT or EMDR trauma therapy. There tends to be holes in that approach. Can you kind of share some of the thoughts of how somatic experiencing approach filled those holes and those gaps for you?
Sure. Yeah, that's a really great question. And, I look at it as, what does trauma impact? And, what we know now and what we see is that it doesn't just impact the mind. And if we're only dealing with the thought process of trauma, we're only seeing a portion of the issue, right? We see in SE, we see that, the imprint of trauma, like you said, the memories being stored in the body are really large. And so a client could be discussing an instance in their childhood and telling me their thought process around it. Meanwhile, in their body, they could experience very intense emotions and sensations. And so for myself as a practitioner to not pay attention to the sensations and emotions and really hone in on the thought process, they may find new meaning. They may find some different strategies to use when triggered in their thinking, but they're really not going to catch the entire integration of healing, in my opinion, right? They may leave the office and maybe they feel a bit more ramped up. Maybe they feel a bit more activated by what was talked about because it's all kind of hanging out in that prefrontal cortex. In the part of the brain where we're obsessing and we're thinking and we're going back and trying to figure out, and that can actually produce more stress, in my opinion. So when we start to incorporate the emotions and the sensations, and even sometimes pay more attention to that than the stories and the thoughts themselves, to me that's the full picture, right? And when a client can experience a feeling of calm and settling in their body, that's a big win. That's a big win. And especially with me dealing with mainly substance abuse clients, for them to feel good in their body again, sober, that is a ginormous deal. Like that's really what they've been trying to achieve for quite a while. And I have found that, when just dealing with the thought process, they're not going to be able to experience that tangible settling that comes from SE.
Yeah, and I totally agree. It's all one unit, right? The body, the mind, the emotions, the spirit. It's all intertwined. And if you're only looking at one part of it, I mean, there's a theory that says if you change one part, it changes the other, which is true. But there's a limit to that, I think, is what you're saying. And if you want a deeper healing, you've got to be able to connect all of those integrative, information flowing parts of our body so that there's wholeness and there's the capacity to do that emotional regulation.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah.
And you've talked about,
I think that's it.
Yeah. And you've talked about emotional regulation as part of the somatic experiencing approach. Talk about what role that I mean, you've talked about it a little bit, but go into a little bit more depth, or maybe relate it back to your recovery of how emotional regulation was super powerful and important.
Totally. Yeah, regulation is kind of a buzzword these days. I see it a lot with other healers and practitioners, and I hear it quite a bit. Everyone's trying to get regulated, right? Or, oh, they don't have any regulation. When I first came into this SE world, I thought that regulation was a synonym for calm. That everything is okay and we can be mindful and we can be present, which those are wonderful things, right? But my teacher says it best, and I'll just, quote him directly, but he said, regulation is responding appropriately to environmental contingencies. Meaning, if something is stressful in our life, respond to that. Something in our life is appropriate. If something is making us angry, of course, feel a healthy amount of anger. So it's about bringing, again, I think I've mentioned this multiple times, we're bringing to the level to stress. And there is a way that we were designed to respond to stress. And so, regulation, for me in my personal experience was, first off, realizing that metaphorically, like my check engine light in my body was very off, right? If I'm engaging in substances to cope with life, something is going on, right? There's a need to numb and there's a need to shut down, and there wasn't always that need. And so, untreated trauma creates these responses that, I would use the word as inappropriate. When we should be alert and alive, we shut down. Or when we should have that healthy form of anger, instead, we do something different. Maybe we don't even approach, maybe we avoid, So there's these things in our life that we are getting into that, I don't know. I feel like I'm losing it a little bit, but it's, we're not responding appropriately, and when I'm regulated, I'm feeling appropriate emotions that are parallel to my experience.
Well, and it's interesting what you bring up too with emotions is because we've been conditioned for so long to respond in certain ways, right? Men, it's okay to have anger and experience anger and express anger, but it's not okay for women. Or
Sure.
A child should be heard and not seen. And some of those cultural messages have been sent for a long time, and we're trying to undo some of those as well as, because you talk about what's an appropriate response, and in my head, I'm like, well, sometimes I just don't know what the appropriate response is. Do I have permission, to call you out and say, I didn't really like the way you just responded to me, and is that safe, right? And so even someone who gets this stuff might be asking those questions and wondering what is an appropriate response.
Totally.
So when you've had trauma and when you've had, when you've been sent messages, especially and I'll use this as a kid, if you've been abused, your boundaries have been violated all over the place, right? And you don't even know what healthy boundaries are. And now you're coming into this world where you've been coping by self-medicating, which is a valid way to work and be able to manage the stuff that's happening. And now you're going to try and do it sober, and you don't have the skills or the ability to do that because it was never modeled for you. You was never taught to you, and you really have no frame of reference. And so I think if we don't address those pieces of what is an appropriate response, what are appropriate emotions, what does that look like? You've got to experience all of that inside your body before you even can address how do I respond to somebody else, right?
Totally. Yeah. And I'm thinking about a question I ask clients often when we're processing. Usually it's abuse that this question comes up. And I say something to the effect of, if you could have done absolutely anything in that moment, what would you have liked to do? And I was speaking with a client not too long ago who endured some physical abuse, and what they said is they wish they could have, just flown away, right, and exited. And yeah, that goes beyond the laws of physics, right? they want to run and they want to exit from the situation that was very dangerous as a child. And so in SE, we may spend a while really visualizing that, right? We call it a corrective experience because that's what the system wanted to do. The system knew that, for this child, that they could not fight back, right, against this abuse, and that they needed to leave, though they weren't able to, right? And so really we're asking that what did the system want to do rather than the mind? And the system always wants to seek safety. That's really what the nervous system is wanting to do. Does that answer your question a bit?
Yeah, and it's a great, I love the way you bring that up in this sense of, as a child who doesn't have a lot of choices, it's not like they can escape some of that abuse because sometimes that very person who is their primary caregiver that is also hurting them creates all sorts of, confusing messages to that child, and they don't know how to escape it or that it's even possible to escape it, which what you bring up is then that's where dissociation comes from. They want to run, and they just run inside, right? They just run inside and disconnect from all of that painful world outside of them. And by allowing them to go look at those emotions and experience that event again, in a safe environment, allows the body to reprocess it in a more healthy, normal fashion with time, with distance, right? With all of those things that get left out when the hippocampus and the hypothalamus and all of those pieces of the brain are not functioning because it's in survival mode, right? And the prefrontal cortex shuts down. So you're talking about some super complex pieces of recovery, but I totally agree that you cannot ignore those pieces. And one way that I love thinking about it is that window of tolerance, right? When we're self-regulating, it's the ability to stay within a window or increase that window of tolerance, or the tolerance that we have for really uncomfortable situations, so that we can stay and look at them and respond differently than we did when we were a child or when we were using or felt unsafe, right? So I love talking about this stuff. As you can tell, it's fascinating to me, and the way our minds and bodies can heal themselves and have the capacity to heal themselves is something else we ought to talk about. I know that as we introduced you, you talked about our innate ability to heal and self-regulate and build resiliency. Can you give us some examples of what that might look like in your journey?
Sure. Yeah, I think about also in my training all these great little nuggets that I received. And one of the first things we did is, we got in partners and we sat across from just another member of the training. And we were prompted to, look at this individual as our client, right? Kind of a role play. And see them within the regard that they have everything they need to heal. And that's kind of an interesting concept, at least to me, being a practitioner and someone coming to me for assistance with their healing, right? That I am a provider and I am here to, bring something to them that they don't have, right? So my belief, and I've seen this in myself absolutely, is that we already have all of these abilities to regulate and to calm ourselves or to, process trauma on our own. But again, it's been interrupted, and there's been kinks that have come in the normal processing that we need another person to shine a light on that. That's not to say that once our stress response is altered, it never goes back to normal. It absolutely can come back to normal. I think that this process of SE is much more about subtraction than it is addition. We're subtracting all of these maladaptive coping skills and these responses that haven't served us to get back to this idea that we were created to seek safety. And when we're able to tune in to our own systems, lo and behold, it's there, right? I can't tell you how many times I've seen a client get so activated, they look like they're about to jump out of their chair. And then we slow things down, and I'm like, hey, let's turn the breathing over to the lungs. I want you to watch yourself breathe for a second. Maybe just notice what's going on in the body. And then slowly but surely, like, I start to see something change. And all I'm doing is just making certain prompts, right? I'm not giving them a handout. I'm not giving them any information that they need to study. They're just tuning into their body's ability to regulate their heartbeat, regulate their stress hormones. And then, they see this, and it's tangible. And so, when I think of the word innate, it's just that it's always been there, right? And we haven't seen it for a while, and I didn't see it for a long while. And then, I remember leaving some of my own personal SE sessions thinking, golly, like I could bring this anywhere. I can access this at any point, right? I don't have to wait until, my next session with my therapist. I can utilize these techniques as I go throughout my life, that it's with me.
I love the way you explain that too, Andrew, is, it's the idea, and you talked about having a facilitator. I like to use that word, a facilitator, somebody to help shine a light on something that seems so typical and usual and familiar. But then when you shine the light on it and you can look at it just a little bit deeper, it shifts those things inside of our bodies. And the thing that you said is sometimes we need help in doing that. And I will tell you that I've been doing processing for a long time, my own work and work with other people. And there is something about connecting with another human being that is healing in many ways. And not just in the witnessing, because witnessing and having witnesses to our pain and validation for that is super vital. But there is something about having somebody else stand outside of your process and be able to shine that light or help you see it that's super powerful. And that doesn't take away from your own internal wisdom, because what you say is correct. We innately bring all of those capacities within ourselves, and we bring them to the table. We have that wisdom. It's there. But tapping into it and having someone help us tap into it is incredibly empowering. So I love the way you talked about that, Andrew, and kind of shared that experience. I think sometimes it feels a little bit untangible. That how do you explain to somebody how we're going to go process this stuff and we're going to go work through it, except to just go do it, right?
That's really it, Shelley. Every time I get asked, like, hey, what is FE? The answer is, let me show you, right? Because it has to be experience. It is very difficult to explain to a client how we're going to be paying attention to sensation and emotion. And at least in the demographic I'm working with, they've never been asked these questions. This is completely, unfamiliar. And I don't know. I don't know many kids that their parents said, hey, like, where do you notice that anxiety in your body? Can you feel that? I for sure was not asked that. Would have been kind of cool if I was. So, yeah, it's really unfamiliar, and it's a very different way of being with ourselves that we have to get to know, right? And we have to kind of befriend this part of ourselves.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I love the way you talk about it. Talk a little bit about the work that you're doing at Granite Mountain Behavioral Healthcare, what they do there, what makes them different, because I know you said that you've really enjoyed working there and it's been a good experience. So talk about that just a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, what I really enjoy about working at Granite, and I just mentioned, is the demographic I get to work with. I mean, these are folks who are primarily coming out of incarceration. It's basically a state-funded facility, and so they are, coming in here is really the last resort, or the last house on the block, so to speak. And most of them have not had access or the ability to access proper therapy or proper clinical help. And so, that's what I really love is feeling that what we're providing to these clients is something that they wouldn't be able to get elsewhere, right? And, secondly, it's a treatment program that incorporates exercise. So we have, we call it strength-based empowerment therapy. I don't run it, but there's some other people who run it, and it's kind of like CrossFit, but it's a bit lighter because, of course, people coming in aren't in the best physical shape. And so they're able to exercise multiple times a week and also engage the brain and the body as they're doing it, right? So we really see it as full healing. And why I think that's such a huge thing for people getting sober and also doing somatic experiencing is, again, they're able to feel that like tangible difference of exercise. And I'm thinking about a client we had come in who, had a lot of trauma, like most of them do, and he was pretty shut down. He was in what we call the freeze response, which I personally relate to. I had lived a long period of my life in that response. And he's going through treatment, and then he goes to his first, it's called Recover Strong. That's the program that they do. He went to his first Recover Strong class where he was moving the body and he was exercising probably for the first time in years. And he had to take a moment. He just started weeping. He went around the corner and he was just bawling his eyes out. And he couldn't exactly explain why. But what I think was going on there is that as he was working out, his nervous system was running, right? The heart rate was up. Certain hormones were being produced in the body that probably haven't been there in a long time. And he was able to discharge little bits of the stress that he was holding. And so being an SE practitioner who works for a treatment center that involves exercise, that there's already an opening to talk about the body. Because that right there is somatic experiencing, what this client went through. And so that's a pretty big draw for me to work with this company. And on a very basic level, some of these people are my closest friends. I've known them for a long time, and so that's really nice to work with other clinicians and administrators that I trust in what they're doing. And I also know them personally, and I know their process, right? And they're in it for heart. So I'd say all of those things really encompass what draws me to Granite.
I love it. And I love the way you talk about the somatic experiencing and processing that way, but you also spent some time talking about how important movement and exercise is.
Yeah.
And it is because, again, you're connected to the body, and it brings up those memories on some way or, on some level. It reminded me of a book that I absolutely love. It's called Spark, The Revolutionary New Science of Exercise and the Brain. It's by John Rady. And he goes in depth about talking about how exercise impacts mental illness, depression, anxiety, and other disorders that people struggle with. And it can be as beneficial as medication. And so exercise should not be minimized. It is super important. And I think the industry's probably got that, most of us have that figured out, that you're not going to do good, wholesome, whole body healing without incorporating that part.
Yeah, it's funny too. I have that book on my bookshelf right now, and it's one of the many books that I'm like, one day I'm going to sit down and really get into that.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
I've heard nothing but good things about Spark, and I know it's right in line with what they're doing at Granite, and I couldn't agree more. I think exercise is really underutilized in the medical world, of course, right? I think most people are catching on to that by now. But what I think is so cool about the exercise portion, especially for those who experience anxiety and activation, or as we would say, the fight or flight. When we're exercising and our nervous system is moving in that way, it really is parallel to someone's experience with anxiety, right? Like the heart rate is up and they're sweating, there's perspiration, thoughts are probably doubtful. I don't know if I'm going to be able to finish this, and that's a lot like anxiety for someone, that experiences it on a daily basis. But in exercise, we're we're producing that ourselves. And so I think if anything, on a basic level, when a client comes in and starts exercising, they're able to normalize their experience of physical anxiety and also not be as resistant to it. And I'm sure that book, Spark, illuminates that so much more. But that's something that's been a really great discussion point for myself with clients.
Yeah, well, and that idea that anxiety, not for everybody, I won't say this is true for everybody, but anxiety often feels the same as being really excited, like you talked about when we're working out, right?
Yeah.
It has a lot of the same characteristics, and it may be a lot, it can be, not necessarily, because it can be, biological as well, but it's the story we tell ourselves about those feelings that can often keep us in a downward spiral. So interesting that you bring that up. I like it. I like the approach, and I like the work that you're doing. I'm wondering if I could ask you maybe kind of maybe it's not a wrap-up question, but I'm wondering if you had to quantify, and this would be maybe hard to quantify, but what was one of the hardest things as you went through your recovery, one of the hardest things that you had to approach or deal with?
You know what? Yeah, it would probably be relapse. And this idea of addiction and alcoholism as a progressive disease, and thinking that if I have the information and I have the self-knowledge, that I'll be okay, right? That I need to be provided with enough information about my maladaptive behaviors, and I'm going to be able to conquer this sobriety thing. But, with my personal recovery, I've had times of recovery that were very constant, and I've had relapses after that fact where, the self-knowledge and the information I had, it helped, don't get me wrong, but it has nothing against active craving and obsession. And so it was very difficult for me to get to a place of regulation. And SE had a really big part with that. For me personally, being less in my brain and more in my body is a very healthy thing. When I hang out in my brain too much, especially as an individual with addiction, I can really get wrapped up in things that just aren't real, things that aren't true. And so, something, there was a huge overcoming for me was coming back from relapses and opening Pandora's box each time when I would return to substances and thinking that I wouldn't be able to make it back. And my own therapy has been really important, and also my, involvement in specific recovery fellowships has been, I would say, equal, if not even more important to that. So I hope that answers your question. But the idea of relapse it's a tricky one, and there's this chronic relapse thing and all these ideas we have about people returning back to substances. And, sometimes our lives get so darn chaotic where we're just trying to seek safety again. And if we don't have if we're not able to get in touch with that innate healing, we will return to something that worked. Right? And in my mind, as an addict in recovery, drugs and alcohol did work at one point. That is my fantasy, that they were working to treat something. And so if I don't find a proper solution, I will return to that.
Right.
So, I've had, my own journey of, getting over those and coming back to healing. So.
Well, that's two really powerful concepts and ideas, is the relapse, because there's so much shame that's been, I don't know, it's shame, however it's come, right? It used to come from the way we did treatment, and it also comes from our own self-loathing and, feeling like we're not worthy. And so that shame is alive and well, and being able to combat the shame by coming back into treatment and going, I must need to learn some more things. I might not have it all, and let's go back and figure out what's missing. in a very
Yeah.
non-shaming way is really great. And then you also talked about relationships being absolutely pivotal for you. Talk about that for just a second.
And are you saying relationships is just connections and?
Yes.
Go
How did
around in
relationships, how did that affect your recovery, and why was it so important?
Oh, I mean, for me personally, it's everything. It's something that I've heard from mentors of mine is recovery works because we're all not crazy on the same day.
Right?
That is so true to me. It works because with the people around me, whether it be someone else who's a part of a certain fellowship, or whether it be a colleague, or whether it be a therapist, it ultimately these connections are really helpful because they don't have my mind talking in their head.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, our views of ourselves and our own process is just very skewed. And I have to recognize that right off the bat. Like, I really wish that I knew everything about myself and that I could kind of be the CEO of my own process, but it's not true. And so, these other connections for me, they're really there as just people that check my reality for me and really bring me back to what's really happening. And I've had the experience of, probably overworking, right? Engaging in like some workaholic behavior, and connections in my life becoming less and less important, and, burning out, and then feeling very isolated and alone in recovery, and not exactly knowing where to turn, and feeling very resistant,
Mm-hmm.
And the only thing that's brought me out of that is my connections. The people around me, certain calls and texts. I mean, they're really simple things. And, what I think is gaining a lot of traction in recovery alongside of what we've been talking about is this idea of human connection really being the biggest part of the process. There's really this, I'm forgetting his name. There's a guy, he has like the biggest TED Talk about addiction. What is his name? Talks a lot about this connection.
The only one I can think of off the top is Brene Brown, but I'm sure, but there's plenty out there. I really like, I like Daniel Siegel as well, but I'm pretty sure that's not who you're talking about.
No, of course I can't think of it now. I've seen his material a million times, and I can't think of his name. But
there's one by Johan Hari. That one's everything you know about.
That's it, right there.
Is wrong.
Yeah, that's the one I'm thinking about. Yeah, he talks about the Rat Park experiment and on all of those. And there's just so many truth to that. So human connection really is the most healing factor. We cannot do this alone. As much as people would like to do recovery on themselves, it has never worked, and it will never work. It has never worked in the past, and it won't work in the future. Ever. So.
But it's an interesting.
Yeah, I know that. Go ahead.
It's an interesting, I want to call it a lie that is perpetrated in our brains, right? Is that we have to do it alone. We can't trust anybody. Everybody that we've known has been unreliable. But you're right. That connection, which often we hear called the antidote to recovery or to addiction, is because we have to feel like we belong somewhere, and we haven't felt that way for a long time, right? And we've got so much self-loathing, so much shame, so much of those pieces that to continually go back to a person or a group of people and know that they love you and care about you and they know your deepest, darkest secrets, there is something so healing, and that place of belonging and acceptance that makes our bodies just take a deep breath and go, oh, I'm not as flawed as I thought I was. I think I'm going to be okay, right? And then all the things that you talked about, Andrew, which were fantastic, of just having that phone call, having someone to be able to, I think about the Johari window where it's got the 4 squares, the stuff we know about ourselves, the stuff other people know about us and we don't, the stuff everybody knows about us and we know about us. And then, the Johari window, right? We need people to reflect back to us because we can't see it all. And it's absolutely essential that we connect. but it feels opposite to addiction, because addiction is isolation and withdrawal and all of those pieces, and it's an interesting dynamic. I love that you bring that up. I appreciate you talking about what was the hardest for you too in your recovery, because it's everybody has a story, whether it's recovery or whether it's healing or whether it's just on the journey of being a human being. And we all need that, these helpful pieces to help us on our own journey and recognize what we might need along that path. And maybe it's somatic experiencing, and maybe it's more mindfulness, and all of those pieces of wholeness and connection. And so I love that you've talked about those and shared some of your passions around treatment. And Andrew, I'm wondering too if I'm sure that other people are going to want to connect with you. They're going to want to learn more about what you're doing, and maybe even do some work with you. Maybe give some ideas of how people can connect and get a hold of you.
Sure. Yeah. Email is the best way at this point. Of course, I'm on LinkedIn and various social media platforms, but my email, it's my name, Andrew Wilkinson, and then the letters SEP@gmail.com, and I check that pretty frequently, so that would be the best way.
Excellent. Awesome. Andrew Wilkinson, thank you for being on with us today and sharing your wisdom and your experience. Super powerful story. And I've learned a lot from you as well. So thank you.
You're so welcome. Yeah, thanks for asking me, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity.
Thanks for being on, Andrew.